Well, my name is Colleen Blankenship. Uh, my unmarried name was Johnson, and I grew up mostly in Washington State, over on the coast, Seattle and Kirkland, and then in my teenage years we came back. In the meantime, we went for 3 years to a ranch in Idaho. It was on the Yankee Fork, which is about 20 miles beyond Stanley towards Chalice. And we lived there for 3 years and had a wonderful time with my family, which consisted of my father, Howard, my mother was Marjorie, my sister was a year younger than I was, and her name was Karen, and my brother was 5 years older, and his name was Paul. And when we moved to Idaho, we moved to a place called the Hideout, and it was up the creek on the Yankee Fork, and we had lots of wonderful fun times there. The story was that some robbers or someone like that had lived there, and so there was a room in the top that was the living room was about 24 by 24, and the room at the top was in the ceiling, and the knotty pine covered the stair. You know, you pull down the stairs, it was kind of hidden, so that the upstairs rooms were secret, supposedly. But we really had fun at the Hideout. And my father grew up a farmer boy, so he always loved animals. And so we had always had animals then and back in Washington. We had cats and dogs and ducks, geese, every kind of animal, almost common farm animals, including horses. My sister and I loved to ride the horses and the donkey that we had there in Idaho. So that was really a special time at the Hideout and at the ranch that we lived on in another place while we were there. Well, after that, we moved back to Washington, and that was where I wanted to talk about my teenage years in Washington. We lived in Federal Way, which is right near the SeaTac airport, and we went to church in an old farmhouse in a little town nearby called Auburn. And it was actually a part of the Tacoma Stakes, so for state conference we would be going to Tacoma, and I have a little story to tell about that. But I'll turn it over to Jim now and let him tell about his early years.
Before I
briefly.
start on me, I'll have to tell you a little story about she and her sister. I have never ridden horses. I got to Idaho. They were living on this ranch, and she had been on horses ever since she was a little girl, and she and Karen. And so they got on their horses, and I tried to get up on mine, and finally I got up there and got hold of the saddle horn and started to say a little prayer. They start off at a full gallop across the desert, laughing, and I'm and you know, I'm about, what, I'm about 29 or 30, and I was just hanging on by all my, I'd never gone that fast on a four-legged animal. And the sagebrush was flying by, but at the end of the summer, I helped train a mare off the range, a wild horse, with the guy that was in charge of the horses. He and I worked with that horse. And in the fall, I got to go, they asked me to go on the roundup, and I was ready to go. Everywhere I took that horse, it was wonderful. And then my brother visited us, and he's a guy that, the great athlete in the family, the guy that always knows everything. Okay, I love him though. But anyway, he came out and he says, I can get on that mare. And I said, well, she's a little skittish. He gets on it and she bucks him off. And so a few hours later, I take her over and give her carrots and everything else. It was really something to see him fly through the air. But anyway, the ranch in Idaho has always been a tie for us. And I love Idaho. And we moved here and been here since 1977. Raised our family, and Colleen taught, and I taught, and we're still here. But my family is a military family. And I was born at Presidio in San Francisco, and October 12th, October 27th, I'm thinking my marriage date already, 1933, so I'm 87 years old. And my dad, of course, was in the Army Air Corps. He flew the mail, and that's where he met my mother in Salt Lake. He was from Minnesota. And Dad was a career Army Air Corps Air Force guy. He retired as a major when we, later on, after the war and everything else was over, but we went from Army post to Army post, and I'd go to a different school every time we moved. So Colleen and I had a lot in common. We were moving and moving, and I was even stationed in the place where I lived at one time when I was in the Army. And Colleen lived close to where I was when I was a child too, in Washington State. So we had similarities there. But then moving around, I moved, I guess the place I remember the most, one, in Illinois, Mrs. Anderson taught me to read. And since then, I minored in history. Art, of course, was a major. My undergraduate minor was history. To this day, I love reading. I also like sports, and that's another story. But I did enjoy so much being with my dad when he was home. He wasn't home very often. So we finally ended up, after we left Illinois, we went to where I went to first grade and learned to read with Mrs. Anderson. But the farm was an interesting place. It had a tornado cellar. Do you know what they are? Okay, over the radio, we had no TV or anything like that, and no telephone really at that time. So we did have a radio, and that's how we would get the tornado warnings were coming in. And my mother would gather us up in the tornado cellar. We were living on this farm out, and you could see corn as far as you could go, and look forever out on the cornfields. And so I would get in the cellar with my mom. My dad was always at the field, we would call it. And sometimes it would be a false alarm, and we would just sit there looking at each other. And then you'd get the all clear, and then you would leave. Then we went to Mississippi, and there my dad was with us, and Pearl Harbor had come. Dad was getting ready to go overseas. But before he could go, he went to OCS. He was the oldest guy to ever graduate from OCS. That's Officer Candidate School. And then he went to North Africa with the B-24s, and they were flying bombing missions out of there to various places, Germany, Romania, the oil fields there, and so on. And so he was older than the other officers and pilots and so on. So Dad was a flight engineer, and he was an engineering officer. That was his thing. And so then it was a time when they were building the B-29, and so Dad was called back to work on the B-29, and that was at Smoking Hill, Kansas. And my mother, we were living in Salt Lake City at the time with my grandmother, and so we had a chance. When Dad was there with us at that time in Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, there was a place where Dad was take us. There was a little island, and he would make us swim from the boat to the island. And every time we swam back, he'd pull the boat out a little further. I think I was about 9, my brother was about 8 or so. We didn't have life jackets or anything. This was part of the ocean. But my dad, he thought he'd toughen us up a little bit. And I'll stop there because I'm a talker, and I'm just going, and I'll turn it back to Colleen.
Well, you didn't drown anyway, did you? Okay, when we moved back to Washington again, the Federal Way, my dad worked for the Tacoma Drug Company. And so he was the old comptroller or whatever. He worked in the finance department before computers. And so he found a piece of property that was on the hillside nearby, and it was very heavily wooded. It was up on the hillside, and it came down to Highway 99 at the bottom. it was 40 acres, and for some reason he was able to buy this property. And so he went up there and he used a bulldozer and he made a road and he made different lots he was going to sell. And he built this nice, modest little house there. And while we were there, we went to church occasionally, and my parents were more or less inactive by this time because when we were in Idaho, there weren't any churches nearby at all for us to go to, and we didn't have a car that would get us over to Cellars, which was 35 miles away, to go to church. So we never went to church at all there, but then we came back and we went to had this little branch out in Auburn, and Mother or Dad or our family would go there occasionally. And so they decided, the Tacoma State decided to take some buses and take all the youth to Salt Lake City to do baptisms in the Salt Lake Temple. And this was when I was 14 years old, and it was about 1954. And so I was really excited, and I wanted to go do this, and very badly. But then we found out that I had to be baptized, and I had never been baptized. And so, and I had asked my dad several times to if I could get baptized through the years. And he had said, well, when your Uncle Will comes to visit us, we'll have him baptize you. And I said, no, Dad, I don't want Uncle Will to baptize me. I want you to baptize me. And as I said, he was fairly inactive in the church then. But we went to see the bishop, or the branch president of that little branch in where we were. And I don't know what they discussed, but it turned out that he said, Dad was a priest, and he said that he could baptize me. And so, but apparently they made some kind of arrangement where he was to start paying his tithing and stop drinking coffee and whatever else there was. And so he did that too, and he baptized me that week just before we left on our trip to Salt Lake. We had a wonderful trip with the youth. I think they took 4 buses down there, and we got to see Elder Hinckley welcomed us at the church office buildings, and it was something that was really important to me. And of course, being baptized was really important too. So that was how I got baptized in the church. And well, Dad went on to be very active. Mom and Dad were very active when we moved to Spokane a little while later, and they went to the temple in 1956. And when Dad was he was active from then on, and he was the branch president of the branch in Albuquerque when we moved down there later on. And in fact, it came time to build a chapel in Edgewood, and they were going to make it a ward. And so they wrote to the church and said that they wanted Dad to be the bishop. And they wrote back and said, well, he's 75 years old. We'd like you to choose someone that's younger. And so the stake president wrote back and said, we want Howard Johnson to be our bishop. And so they agreed to it, and he was a bishop there for a couple of years. But it was a big change from when they were inactive when I was in junior high school. And your turn again, Jeter.
Well, you look back on your life and my point of view and trying to condense it and make it, make some sense. It's difficult. But while Dad was overseas, we moved from Keesler Air Force Base to Salt Lake City and stayed with my grandmother in her house at 940 East 17th South. And there were no men. My aunts, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all these aunts, and my grandmother, and my mother, and my sister, and my brother and I, and then our younger brother Ernie. And the men were all at war. And it was a pretty serious time. I had a cousin who was a Hellcat pilot, but before that he was at East High School. He was cadet colonel, honor student. He was very active in the church. And he was going to become a medical doctor, but he went into the Naval Air Corps instead. And he became a pilot. And he came home on leave. And of course, I was about 10 then, and I just thought a fighter pilot would be the greatest way. We could go out there and shoot down all those enemy planes like John Wayne and everything. Well, about a month after he came and visited us, he was killed in an accident. He and another fellow from Texas were flying their Hellcats. And at night, and it's an airplane that flies over 400 miles an hour, and he was killed. And all of a sudden, I started to feel about my father. He was overseas now with the B-29s, flying missions. And he was in, at that time, he was in China, Burma, India, and then later on Tinian, Saipan in the Marianas. This is with 20th Bomber Command. And he was, earlier, he was with the Mediterranean Air Corps over there, the Air Force. Flying B-24s instead of B-29s. But I really, as a little boy, I started to fear for my father very much. And I really, I didn't think that anyone in our family would ever be killed in war. I never thought my father would ever be. And, but all of a sudden that illusion was shattered. And so I did go to the LDS church occasionally. They had, they would meet. Primary would be held in the middle. It'd be Tuesday or Wednesday. I'd go to that sometimes. But my grandmother she had visiting teachers, ward teachers come by. And I wondered what those guys were doing in the house because all these women are around me. And, but I did get a little bit curious about it. And I was in a Cub Scout program run by the Presbyterian Church. And we got to wear a uniform, Cub Scout uniforms, and I hated the knickers. You guys never had to wear those, but But Mr. Nyman was one of the few men that he was old enough that he was in the First World War, but he was too old for the Second. But he was a professor at Westminster College, and he walked from Westminster back to 940 East 17th South. He lived right next door to us. And he was a wonderful man, and I was looking for a role model. Dad wasn't around. I had my uncles, all of them were gone. So I identified with him. And scouting was always something I loved, and my boys loved it, and my brothers loved it, and scouting was a wonderful program. And it meant a great deal to me, and Mr. Nyman was very instrumental. And then the war ended. Everyone came home, and after 3 years of no father, I had to readjust to a military-style father. And so he decided to stay in the military, and we went to Edwards Air Force Base. It was Muroc Army Air Base at that time. And Dad was participating in all of the early stuff, in breaking the sound barrier and all this kind of stuff, working with people. I had no idea what he's doing. All I know is we didn't see him. He was out early in the morning, coming back late at night. But my mother was there, and I had buddies, and I had scouting. I had a little friend named Punky Porter. He'd come over with a baseball mitt early every morning and doing like this, let's go, let's go. So sports became something I loved, scouting I loved. And, but I never saw my father very much. But that's what happens when you have a military father. They're not around much. But when he was there, he'd take us fishing occasionally. He'd take us up in the hills hiking and doing things that he liked. And so anyway, I'll turn it back to my wife. And
No, you're right at the point. Why don't you tell
well,
about the
I
car?
better,
The car that came.
Okay, I'm a Utah State guy, but the University of Utah is the reason that I joined the church. We had an old Chrysler sitting out in front of, we were living in a housing project. And I won't describe what they are, but they're not very pleasant, but that's where we always lived, in the military housing or in, rented housing or whatever. We never had any house of our own. But anyway, out in front, we had this old 39 Chrysler. In the back of it, there was a University of Utah sticker. And along came these missionaries, 2 of them. And they were riding a motor scooter, both of them on the motor scooter. Now, these are big, tall, basketball-type guys. And here they were putting up there. Now, I wasn't there at that time, but they came by, and they talked to my mother, and they wanted to meet, my brother and I and my sister. And so they came by later, and I got to meet them. And I found out they were marvelous basketball players, Elder Goodwin and Elder Nixon. They were from Idaho Falls, Idaho. And they invited me to go practice with them. And oh boy, I loved basketball at that time. I was on the 7th grade team, and I thought I was hot stuff. So I went down there, and these guys were, you couldn't watch, there's no television to watch people. You'd go and watch the high school games and think, well, this is a great way to play, but that's all we ever learned. But we did have a fellow who volunteered and worked with us at the elementary school, so we had a chance to learn the basics. But they let me practice with them, and I really enjoyed that. And I got closer to them and closer to them, and then they asked my parents first if we could be baptized. I wanted to be baptized. I didn't know anything about gospel, but I knew these guys were great. So they took us out to an irrigation pond, and I was baptized, and I was almost 14, and my sister was baptized, Ann, and my brother Clay and I. And then I became a member of the church, and I was baptized a deacon and had a chance to pass the sacrament. And we were holding our meetings in the, they call it, where the Demolays would meet. It was the, what was it, Colleen?
The Catholics?
No.
Oh, it was like some building, right?
Yeah, well, it was the, anyway, it belonged to another religious organization, and we were there, the Masons, Masonic Lodge. There it is. Okay, I clicked on my 87-year-old brain. But anyway, then I'll stop and let Colleen go ahead, because that's, I did become active in the church.
Well, tell them what your father said about it. He wasn't a member.
When I joined the church, Dad sat me down. He says, well, the Mormons are pretty strict people. He said, but now you're baptized, you have to live up to this. And this is coming from my dad, never went to church. He hated church because his mother died, and he had all these successions of housekeepers, and he went to different churches all the time. And my grandfather was a school superintendent, and my grandmother was a teacher and also an artist, Anna Stella Hay. A little Scottish lady who I inherited her genes for my art talent. But anyway, I sidetracked that. But let's go back to Colleen.
Okay, so he was willing to live up to it and go to church every Sunday, his dad said, and do what he was supposed to. So that was great advice from his dad, even though he wasn't a member. So I'm going to quickly finish so that Jim can talk about his art, which he really loves. But I finished high school in Spokane, and I wanted to go to BYU, and my dad said, oh, no, you're not going that far away. And my mom didn't think that would be a good idea either, but I was very persistent and just kept up with it. So finally he gave in, and I went off to BYU and graduated from BYU, and taught for 1 year after I graduated in Ogden at the high school. I taught drama and debate and speech there for a year. And boy, that first year of teaching is always the toughest. And at the end, I went with our stake. My sister came and went with me too, and we went with the stake on a rafting trip down the Colorado River. and we were on the river for 9 days, and I thought that was really cool. The state girls got to do something that was as adventurous as this, and someone was in charge of taking the rafts and everything, and it was really a big thing. We ended up at the Glen Canyon Dam while it was being built. It was being built, and we could stand up on the top and look down into the cavern of the dam, what the dam would be like there. And on the way, we climbed up to the, what is that, Rainbow Bridge. It was 5.5 miles up there now, and I understand with the lake there, it's like a mile up to there, but it was 5.5 miles. The farthest I'd ever hiked, and I swore never again would I hike that far, except we did go on one other fun hike there. While we were down there, we went to the hole in the rock. And if you've heard about the pioneers that built a ramp down the 300-foot sheer cliff, they were able to build a ramp down there and take 26 wagons and the horses down to the river, cross the river, and then go up the other side, which they called the Bloody Gorge, because it took all the skin off the horses' legs just to pull the up to this place after they had been across there. So if you ever get a chance to go to the hole in the rock, I think it's a wonderful adventure to go to. And after I'd been teaching for a year, I decided to go back to BYU and get my master's degree. And so I went that summer, and during that summer was when I met Jim. And we were married after we had met for 7 weeks. we went up to the Logan Temple and got married up there. He said that was the place he wanted to go.
Well, the Salt Lake Temple was closed. I was 29, almost 29, and I saw this beautiful redhead at the dance, and I just couldn't resist her. So, but she was happy to go to the Logan Temple, and it was.
Well, I said, shall we go to Manti because the Salt Lake Temple's closed? He says, there's only one temple. We're going to the Logan Temple. That old Utah State guy. Okay, tell him about your artwork, honey.
Well, let me just tell them one thing about Salt Lake City during the wartime. Everything was rationed. Food, you only got so much of everything. You didn't go anywhere in an automobile. You had a sticker on it, told you how far you could go depending on the letter in it. When I was down along the coast in Mississippi, all of the lights would shut out because of the enemy planes they thought were going to bomb. And then when I was a little boy walking along the beach in Mississippi, the enemy submarines were sinking ships right off the coast. And I saw the debris coming in as my brother and I were swimming there. It was a very real war. We were all in it. And my little friends there would have a little star. If the father was killed in the war, it turned gold. It was blue if they were serving. It was if they were wounded, it was silver. And everyone had flags with stars, and in the window. And that was something I remember. And then also another thing very critical to me is when I went from California to Wiesbaden, Germany for 2 years when my dad was with the airlift. I was always, where Dad would go, I would go. We would, as family. And Wiesbaden was, they were flying into Berlin because it was blockaded by the Russians. And Dad and the airmen were flying the food in because the Russians wouldn't allow any food or coal, and it was blockaded. And the Cold War was a very real thing. And so there are all these ugly realities. But while I was there, when I first got there, I went outside of Munich and the Dachau concentration camp. They took us through that, the military told, where the Germans had put these people in who happened to be Jewish or other religions or politically against Nazism. And they would be forced labor until they died. And if they stopped working, they would put them in furnaces and burn the bodies. and I saw the furnaces. It's real. The concentration camps were real. Hate is real, and religious hate is one thing that is such a terrible thing, and also racial, because most of them were Jewish. So that was something for a 15-year-old boy to go through. And so I've always been very careful about my opinions of other religions or other races and people, because I think it's a very dangerous thing, this hatred of other people because of their religion or their race or what they believe. So this was important. It's more important than art. And I wanted to tell you that because I remember that so clearly. Okay, after Germany, we came back to Utah. My dad was at Hill Air Force Base. He retired there. I went to Weber. I played football. I played tennis. I got to be a pretty good tennis player. I enjoyed that. I got hit in football and totaled my knee, and so football was over. I was actually happy in a way. I was smaller and slower than the big guys, and they were faster and hit harder. So, but you get a warped idea of your own what you believe in athletics. Your abilities here and your dreams are here, and so sometimes they don't work out too well. But the tennis, I happened to, at one of her class reunions, I beat her old boyfriend in straight sets. I didn't let him win one game. Well, anyway, let's get a little more serious on this. But then I came back to Utah. I graduated from high school. I got a scholarship in art to Weber Junior College, where I told you I played football and tennis. And I worked at night after I was through with athletics, and I worked in the summer, worked my way through. And then I transferred to Utah State, where I got my bachelor's degree in teaching. And then I went in the Army for 2 years. It wasn't too exciting. I was working with messages, and we were doing coding. And when I got out, I got into a reserve unit, which was artillery and boom, 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 and that kind of thing. But then that was over. And I found myself at BYU, and I had been teaching for 3 years in a junior high and 1 year at Ogden High. And they offered me a teaching assistantship at BYU. And I'd been going to school at Utah State, but then I had a friend I was teaching with, so Jim, come down to BYU with me. And so I did. And then I met Colleen there, and we were married, and we moved to many, many places. How many times did we move?
17 times in 17 years. It's just like we moved all our lives.
Yeah, and then I went to art school in New York, and Colleen worked as a secretary. And then we were in Hawaii. I taught at Church College. It's BYU Hawaii now. And I was teaching art as a professor there, and Colleen was teaching English and speech. But at night, she was getting her master's degree at the University of Hawaii, and I had little kids with bottles and diapers, and Jim was one of them, and Sean. And so anyway, after that, I went back to school, got my MFA. We were in New York for a while. I don't want to go there, but the art museums were great, and Colleen also worked as a secretary there. But then I had an opportunity. I taught high school in California for 3 years, and then I had an opportunity to come and interview at Boise State. And so that was in 1977, and we've been here ever since. And so we've been very happy, and we've raised our family, and we've had wonderful friends in the church and out of the church, and I love my students. I love Boise State. I have mixed emotions when they play Utah State and BYU, but of course, my allegiance is very much to Boise State. It's a wonderful school. Okay, and here we are. We raised a family almost. We're still raising some of them, but we're still, it's one of those things that goes on and on. Well, I will say this, that ability is something you have to find in Heavenly Father blesses all of us with talent. Remember the parable of the talents. You don't want to bury your talent. Develop it, grow it, love it, and you'll find your dreams. But you have to work hard at it. If you do sports or scouting or things like this, or a musical instrument. This is really important. Now, my work is not as important as my teaching, but in order to teach art, I had to learn all I could about it. And so my paintings represent a lot of interest. They're portraits, they're landscapes, there are all kinds of different things. But this is a huge painting, and I like to do landscapes because I had a show at Boise State, and this is a painting that was in it. And this is the jug handle here in McCall. And I used to ride my bike along the Farm to Market Road, and I always wanted to do this. And I did a separate painting that had the mountain, and then all of a sudden I decided I'd add the sky to it. And then I was having trouble with the foreground, so I put these little verticals in down here. But I think Heavenly Father has created a wonderful world for us. And a lot of my art that I love, I think, the most is the landscape. I love being alone and hiking in the hills with my little dogs and riding my bike and getting out in nature. And you see wonderful things that Heavenly Father has. And I've learned to observe warm and cool colors, darks and lights, being able to render form and take a dream and an idea that you have and put it into, like my wife, when she writes, she thinks about things and then she puts it in a wonderful, beautiful written form. But this is a visual expression of the feelings I had when I was puffing along here on my little bike. And I didn't take the dog with me then, and it was just myself and the dog. And I have some others. I love dogs. This has 1981. I was teaching at Boise State, and I did this as a demonstration for my students. We had an old man that loved his dog, and so I did this painting of him. And he was an ex-Marine from World War II, and this is his family right here. He wasn't a member of the church, but I think in some ways he was very much alone, and he didn't have. This was his family right here, and he loved posing for us, and it was fun. I enjoyed it. This is oil. The other one is acrylic. Oil means you're using oil as a medium to dissolve your paints and so on. And this is canvas. I'm working on canvas, and this is an oil painting, and I don't work much in oil because of the fumes anymore, but it will give you things you can't get any other way. Now this is one I did in oil also, and I like oil for portraits. This is a girl named Laura, and she was in my art class, and her father was a minister. And when I thought I saw the long hair, she came in, and I was her advisor also, and I asked her if she'd pose for me in this long gown, and she played the violin, but she didn't play the cello. I had to rent this from Telford's, but he didn't charge me any rent for it because I was an artist and he's a musician. So anyway, I posed her, but I couldn't work from her until her mother came in because she was a preacher's daughter. And so the whole time we were kind of talking about my religion, her religion, and Laura was here playing the cello. It was kind of an interesting, but this was fun. I enjoyed it. She was a lovely girl. But I want you to remember something about musician and when you see these musicians and these young people taking lessons and how dedicated they are and the discipline, it's just like in athletics. You have to have that mindset to achieve something. And she had that. Music was very important to her as well as art. So this was kind of fun to do. And now, if you are desperate for models to work from, you do yourself. And this is me. And this is a tribute to my little Scottish grandmother, Anna Stellar Hay. This is the Hay plaid here. And this is an abstract painting. Yes, I do abstractions too. If you're a teacher, you have to do a lot of different stuff because your kids like to do a lot of different stuff. So what I did, I put this behind me, and then I had a mirror, and I did the abstraction and put that down, and it was a copy of a big abstraction I have, which is an abstraction of the semi-abstraction, because it still has a lot of form. A full abstraction will be so abstract that the form is lost and it's more an interpretive thing. But this one, I got my wedding ring here. I had a lot of fun doing it. I had a beautiful subject to work from, very handsome fellow, and it was, but anyway, there's something, if you look in the mirror at yourself, and you're a bald-headed guy, you really need a hat, so I had to put this little hat on there, so I pay a tribute to my grandmother, Hay, and also satisfy my own ego. And artists do have egos. Let me put this away, and I'll get one more here. Okay. This is one that I did, a larger one of a smaller painting I had in a major art show, and but I decided to do a bigger one. And this is when I was a student in Los Angeles, the Oda Art Institute, working on my Master of Fine Arts degree. And this is one I did later from the smaller painting. But this is MacArthur Park, and I noticed all these elderly people. And I was a young man doing this. And now there's a time frame here. And time is something we don't really understand it well enough. I mean, we talk about time and space and all these theories far beyond our own imagination and our own minds. But here, their time, they're retired. Most of them moved from other places to a warm place to play cards and sit and visit. And I tried to capture that. And it was warm enough where he could take his shirt off. But I wanted to make a comment on our society and what people, how they kind of drift along in life. And these little groups here and here meant something to me. And there was an expression here that I wanted to record because of my own feeling for humanity and my empathy for these people. And also I played with color and shapes and forms and all the things that people do if you're an artist, and you have to make the painting work too, as well as what you're trying to say in it. Okay, I think that, let's see, what else have I got here to drag?
I wanted to show you a book that he did of his artwork, and these are all different things that he did, and I think that was pretty cool that he made up a book of his art. So
okay.
Some of the things that he's done.
I like my kids to have fun in school, and so in art in both college and high school. And so we did fun little paintings sometimes, and I have them do things from things that are interesting. Now, I love pastries like this. They're really good to eat, but and after you paint them, you can eat them. And they're small, and they're little acrylics like this. When I was giving a demonstration for a high school, local high school, in fact, Anna Blankenship, my granddaughter, is now an art teacher, and I'm quite proud of her. And she graduated from Southern Virginia University, and she is teaching art in Arizona. And I do have pride in my grandchildren. And my children, maybe, yes, I do at times. I'm sorry, Jim. But anyway, this was fun to do, and color, and just pulling out the stops and playing with it. And it wasn't quite so serious, but it's a lot of fun. And I had the kids do a lot of fun projects. Colleen, though, had the best project of all. Tell them about the rocks.
Oh, when I was teaching in junior high, I had pet rocks. And the kids would really like to make jokes about all that. And sometimes they would steal my pet rock and threaten to make sand out of it if I didn't pay them a hostage fee. And, or if they got really bored listening to what we were doing in class, a couple of the boys would be in back making a little fence around the pet rocks or something. It was just a fun thing to do in school. So, but we really enjoyed doing this, and the advice that I had to leave for you all is never give up, because there were many times in my life, like I said, when I wanted to be baptized and when I wanted to go to BYU, but I just never gave up. And maybe that's what you have to do with your parents sometimes, is keep on until they see that it's really important to you. And we're really happy to be in this ward, and we're happy that our grandchildren and children, you know them too, and that's how we feel.
Well, I think that Colleen really said that you're not giving up, but also there are people who come along, I call them mentors in my life. And I remember at Utah State, I'd run out of money. The Air Force ROTC said my eyes were too bad for pilot training, so I was washed out of that program, and I was pretty unhappy with the way I was going with my grades and everything, and so I decided I was just going to quit and go in the Army and get it over with. And so I had my bags all packed and everything, and I was living in this old house with 4 other guys, and it's not conducive to study, but we had a lot of fun. But anyway, Harrison Groudage was my art instructor, and he found out about it. And he's a great big guy. He's about 6'2". He looks like a fugitive from a professional football lineman, you know, that kind of a build. And I hear this knock at the door, and he comes to the door, and I answer it, and he said, "Where are you going?" And he had that kind of a voice. And he was my art professor, and I said, "Well, Grout." We called him Grout. His name was Groudage, but that was his nickname we gave him. And I said, "Well, Grout, I'm going to go in the Army." He said, "Well, what if I found you a job?" And I said, "I'm listening." So he got me a job lettering certificates for cows that were, when a farmer got an award for his cows and his milk, the quality of it, I would write and do a certificate. And I was pretty good with lettering, and it was something I learned at Weaver Junior College. And I did the lettering, the signing, and big billboards and all of that. I learned to do that. And so it kind of saved my bacon at that time, because it was enough money for me to finish the quarter out. And then I came back the next 2 quarters and graduated with my degree in Bachelor's of Science in Art Education, and with my art and history. And I wasn't in the ROTC, so I couldn't go into that. So as soon as I graduated, I went down and told them, I'm ready to go, Army. And the way I did, and I spent my 2 years active duty and then the reserve time and so on, went through my teaching career up to the point where I got my graduate teaching fellowship at BYU, and I met Colleen and married her. And my advice is, as she said, don't ever give up. And there's always someone that comes around at the right time in the right place. And here she is.
Hang on a second, we got cards. Hey, Martha.
Well, great. Any advice for you gave lots of advice to the kids here.
You're not
Any
getting
advice
questions out of pardon.
for your grandkids or future
Yeah.
generations?
Yep, never give up. And never ever give up. Oh, our testimony?
Yeah.
Well, I've lived the church my whole life, and even when I was little, and Mother took me to church in Seattle, in the Queen Anne ward at Mother's Day, and I had to give a talk, and I gave a talk on Jesus walking on the water, and they said that I did so well in the junior primary or whatever, I could give this talk at Mother's Day. So on Mother's Day, I stood up to give the talk, but it was a whole room full of people, the whole church, and I just froze and couldn't give the talk. But ever since that time, I've loved the church, and Jim and I, when we first met, we both said, well, when we marry, we're going to marry in the temple, and that's what we did.
Well, one thing I'll mention, when I was in the Army, my bishop wrote to me and kept in touch with me for 2 years. And when I came home, he helped me to kind of readjust to things. And when I was younger, as a teenager, I did enjoy going to church very much. But there were a group of kids at school that were into partying and all of this. And I can remember in high school, I'm glad I didn't go down to the University of Utah, not because it isn't a good school, but they went down there, they wanted me to join this fraternity. And I decided, these guys are drinking beer in high school, and I thought, I don't want to go down there. Those guys are going to bomb out the first quarter, and most of them did. And I'm so glad that I didn't let them influence me to do that. Now, it was difficult because in my family, my father was a member of no church. My mother was not active in the LDS church. And so, but I had a bishop that cared about me. Remember what I told you about mentoring? Well, this bishop was a special person who took the time to listen to me. And then I remember another bishop at other times, a young man. And then when I got older, when I was teaching in Ogden, in the junior high, the experienced teacher that was there was a Navy veteran, and he was a very strong LDS person, and he was the one that was going down to BYU that convinced me to go down to BYU so I could meet Colleen. And after that, we've been active in the church. I've been in 2 bishoprics, and I love scouting. I was varsity scout leader and used to love going on the trips with the boys. And I think that's the reason Jim got into scouting as a career. And because we went on all those hikes together, we had a lot of fun in scouting. And I think that was a testimony to me, as the outdoors, being in the thing that Heavenly Father's created, is a wonderful testimony to me. But there's so many people that come along in your life that are positive, good people that are there and help you. Your teachers at school, your bishop, your scoutmaster, the young women's leaders, all these people are there for you and have good role models. I think that helped me because I always felt that my experience with the military and with my father was the idea that you have to have a belief in something beyond. He had that even though he didn't go to church. And I think in my own spiritual experience with him, that even though he didn't go to church, he was very close to, the kind of values that I see in the church. And so that helped me a great deal.